The barn was burning. Her wedding dress was still in the trunk upstairs, and the man who was supposed to be her brother in 3 days was bleeding to death on the kitchen table. And there was no doctor in 40 miles, and the only blade in the room was the rabbit knife in her hand. Hattie Ashford had never taken a bullet out of a man before. She had watched a country doctor do it once when she was 14 years old. She held the small, thin blade in the orange flame of the lamp until it glowed faintly blue, and she looked at the two brothers holding their wounded brother down, and she said the only words she had left: "Whatever sound he makes, do not let go of him." This is the story of the bride who came west on the word of a stranger, the three brothers who had been waiting 17 years for a war to end, and the night a woman from Philadelphia learned what kind of woman she was always going to be. The April wind came down off the Bitterroot Mountains the way it always did in 1879, carrying the last bite of winter in its teeth, and Harriet Ashford stood alone on the wooden platform of Granite Falls Station, with her hands wrapped tight around the handle of a battered leather trunk that held everything she still owned in this world. She had been standing there for 3 hours. The stagecoach that brought her in from the railhead had rattled away long ago, kicking up a cloud of yellow dust that still hung in the air over the wagon road, like a ghost that had not yet decided to leave. The driver had looked at her once before he climbed back to his seat, looked at the navy blue traveling dress that had been fine 4 days ago and was now gray with road dust, looked at the small carpet bag in the trunk and the way she held herself too straight, and then he had touched the brim of his hat and said nothing at all. Some men know when a woman is too proud to be pitied. He had been one of them. Now there was only the platform and the wind and the 4 squat buildings that made up the entirety of Granite Falls, Montana territory. A general store with peeling paint, a blacksmith shop with a cold forge, a boarding house called Pine Needle Inn whose sign creaked on rusted hinges, and a livery stable where a single old gray mare stood with her head down, half asleep in the late afternoon sun. Beyond all of it, the mountains rose blue and gray, an impossible climbing into a sky so wide and so empty that Hattie Ashford felt for the first time in her 22 years of living that she had walked clean off the edge of the known world. She drew the letter from inside her glove for what must have been the 20th time. It was creased now, soft along the folds from too much handling, and the ink had begun to bleed where her thumb had pressed against it during the long dark hours on the train. But the words were still there. The words were still real. "My dear Miss Ashford," the letter said, "when you arrive at Granite Falls Station, my brother Ezra will be there to meet you. He is a quiet young man, the gentlest soul in 3 counties, and you will know him by the fiddle he carries on his saddle. Reverend Pratt of Stillwater Mission will be with him. We will be married that same afternoon if you find me agreeable, and then I will bring you home to the ranch my brothers and I have built with our own hands. There is a room waiting for you that has not been opened in 17 years. It was my mother's room. I think she would want a good woman to sleep there again. Your servant in patient hope, Callum Holloway." Hattie folded the letter and pressed it back inside her glove against the warmth of her wrist. There was no Ezra. There was no Reverend Pratt. There was no fiddle and no saddle and no quiet young man with gentle eyes. There was only the wind and the mountains and the slow, heavy realization climbing up the back of her throat like cold water rising in a well. The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. She thought of her father, then the way she always thought of him when the world tried to break her. She thought of the small parsonage in Philadelphia where he had preached for 30 years, the smell of pipe tobacco in his study, the worn leather of his Bible with her mother's pressed forget-me-nots still tucked between the pages of Ruth. She thought of the last winter, the one where she had sat by his bed for 93 nights and read aloud to him until his breath went thin, and then thinner, and then stopped altogether between one verse and the next. She thought of how the people of his congregation had brought casseroles for a week and then forgotten her name. She thought of the small room on the 3rd floor of the Holbrook house where she had lived for 3 years as a governess to 2 children who were not hers, and of the way Mr. Thaddeus Holbrook had begun looking at her after his wife was buried last September, the way his eyes had moved over her at supper, the way he had pressed a gold pocket watch into her hand and told her it was a gift for her good service, and the way she had understood at once that the watch was not a gift but a chain. She had answered the advertisement that night by lamplight, sitting on her narrow bed, and she had not let herself cry until she sealed the envelope. Now here she was, 3 hours into the wrong end of America, and no one was coming. A boot heel struck the wooden boards behind her, and Hattie turned. The man who walked toward her down the platform was tall and broad through the shoulders, and bearded with a black beard that had not been trimmed in some time. He wore a long oilcloth duster, the color of old tobacco, and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, and there was a dark stain on his left cuff that might have been coffee and might have been something else. He moved the way men move who have been drinking since noon and are pretending they have not. When he was 10 paces from her, he stopped and lifted his hat, and she caught the faint, sour smell of whiskey on the wind. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I'm here to fetch you. Name's Crane. Obadiah Crane. I work for the Holloway brothers." He smiled at her then, and his teeth were the color of weak tea, and Hattie Ashford felt every small hair on the back of her neck rise straight up underneath her collar. She had grown up in a house full of careful watching, a mother who died slow, a father who preached to men in jail and brought their stories home to the supper table. 3 years in a household where she had learned to read the silences of a man before he learned to read them in himself. She knew without knowing how she knew that this man was lying. She knew because a letter had said Ezra would come, and Ezra had a fiddle, and this man carried no fiddle and had no horse in sight. She knew because his eyes had touched her trunk before they had touched her face. She knew because when he said the name Holloway, he said it the way a man says the name of a place he used to live and was asked to leave. But she did not run. A woman who runs invites a chase. She had learned that too. "Mr. Crane," she said, and her voice came out steadier than her hands. "I am very grateful you have come. I have been traveling 4 days, and I am in need of a moment of privacy before we set out. Would you be so kind as to wait while I step inside the inn? I shall not be long." "Of course, miss," he smiled wider. "I'll be right here with your trunk." Hattie made herself smile back. "Thank you," she said. "You are very kind." Then she walked. She did not hurry. She walked with the small, slow, dignified steps her mother had taught her for funerals and weddings, and she did not look back, and she crossed the street to the Pine Needle Inn and pushed open the door with her gloved hand and stepped inside, and only when the door had closed behind her did she allow herself to breathe. The woman behind the desk of Pine Needle Inn was small and round, and somewhere on the far side of 60 with gray hair pinned up under a lace cap and a face like a winter apple. She had been writing in a ledger when Hattie came in, and now she set down her pen and looked at Hattie over the rim of her spectacles for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "Child, you sit down before you fall down." Hattie sat. She had not realized she was about to fall down. The chair was a simple ladder-back chair with a cushion stitched in red wool, and when she was in it, she discovered that her knees were shaking. The woman came around the desk and laid one small, warm hand on Hattie's shoulder. "My name is Beatrix Fenwick," she said. "I have been the widow Fenwick of this town for 21 years, and I know every man who passes through it. The man on the platform is named Obadiah Crane. He used to run the cattle for the Holloway brothers up at Stillwater Ridge. They turned him out 6 weeks ago for stealing yearlings and selling them off the mountain. He is not a man you go anywhere with. Not in a wagon, not on a horse, not down the road for a glass of water. Do you understand me, child?" Hattie looked up into the small, kind face. "Yes," she said. "I understand. You came on the eastbound stage today. Are you the bride?" The word hit Hattie in the chest like a small stone. "I'm Harriet Ashford," she said. "Mr. Holloway and I have corresponded since November." Widow Fenwick nodded once as if this confirmed something she had already half guessed. "Then you come with me," she said. "There was a room upstairs at the back of the house. The window looks down on the platform. We will watch from up there together until Callum Holloway himself comes for you, and he will come for you, child, because Callum Holloway is the kind of man who comes when he says he will come. Something has gone wrong out on the road. That is all. Now up you get. Hattie went up the narrow stairs behind the small, straight back of the Widow Fenwick, and at the top of the stairs, she stopped and looked down through the banister at the front door of the Pine Needle Inn. And then she went into the room at the back of the house, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she pressed both hands flat against her knees to make them stop shaking. The window looked down on the platform. Obadiah Crane was still there, standing beside her trunk, smiling at the empty doorway of the inn, the way a wolf smiles at a den he believes a rabbit has gone into. 20 miles north and east of Granite Falls on the high green shoulder of Stillwater Ridge, the wind was moving through the apple tree by the kitchen window of the Holloway house. It was a tree that had been planted by a woman named Sarah Holloway in the spring of 1850, the year she had come west with her young husband and a wagon full of borrowed seed. She had carried the seedling all the way from Pennsylvania wrapped in damp burlap, and she had set it in the ground with her own hands and watered it with snowmelt every morning for a month. And now it was a great gnarled old thing in full white bloom, and Sarah Holloway had been dead for 17 years, and her 3 sons stood under the branches of her tree and argued about a woman none of them had ever seen. Callum Holloway stood at the kitchen door in a clean blue shirt that he had ironed himself the night before. He was 35 years old and 6 feet 7 inches tall in his stocking feet, and he had hair the color of dark chestnut wood that had begun to go gray at the temples 3 years before its time, and his eyes were the deep amber of whiskey held up to firelight. He had been the head of his family since the night his parents were murdered in a snowstorm in 1862, when he was 18 years old, and he had worn the weight of that on his shoulders for 17 years. And he wore it still, and there was a small wooden box in his shirt pocket with a plain gold ring inside it that his father had given his mother on the day they married. His youngest brother stood on the porch with his arms crossed and his face like a thunderhead. "You did what Ransom said." "I wrote to her," Callum said. "I wrote to her since November. Today is the day she comes. You wrote to a woman from a newspaper advertisement, and you did not tell us. I am telling you now. You are telling me now because she is on a train, and there is nothing I can do about it." Callum did not answer. There was nothing to answer. His youngest brother was 26 years old and had loved a woman 2 years ago who had taken every dollar he owned and ridden out of Granite Falls with a faro dealer in the back of a freight wagon, and the wound of it was still raw, and Callum knew it was raw, and Callum had still done what he had done because some things a man does not ask permission for. The middle brother came around the corner of the house carrying a fiddle. His name was Ezra Holloway, and he was 29 years old, and he was as tall as his older brother, but built leaner, with hair the color of pale honey and eyes the soft cold blue of a winter creek. And he had been the gentle one of the 3 since he was 4 years old, and had cried for an hour when their father shot a wounded deer in the back pasture. He carried the fiddle the way other men carry a rifle, casual and constant, the bow tucked under the strings and the case slung over one shoulder by a worn leather strap that had been their mother's hair ribbon once. He looked from Callum to Ransom and back again, and he set the fiddle down on the porch rail very carefully. "What happened?" Ezra said. "Our brother sent away to Philadelphia for a wife," Ransom said. "Like a man orders a saddle from a catalog, and he did not see fit to tell us." Ezra looked at Callum for a long time. Then he said, "When does she arrive?" "Today," Callum said. "This afternoon, I sent Crane down with the spring wagon at first light." "Crane? I did not send Crane," Callum said quickly. "I sent word to old Hawkins at the livery to drive her up. Crane has been gone 6 weeks. I do not know how he heard about her. But the post road runs through 3 Pines, and there is only one mail rider, and that mail rider stops at the Crow's Nest Saloon every Friday, and the Crow's Nest is where Crane has been drinking since I turned him out. He could have read every letter that came back from Philadelphia if he wanted to." Ezra closed his eyes for one long second. Then he opened them and said, "Saddle the bays. I am going with you." Callum looked at his middle brother and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was tight. Ransom did not move. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed and his face hard as the granite of the ridge behind him, and he looked at his older brother across the 8 years that separated them. And he said, if she is another Caroline Beaumont, I will not call her sister. I will not say her name at this table. Do you understand me? Yes, Callum said. I understand you. Ride. They rode. The Pine Needle Inn was very quiet now. The widow Fenwick had brought up a cup of black coffee and a slice of brown bread with butter and a pot of honey from the kitchen, and Hattie Ashford had eaten because the widow Fenwick had told her she must eat, and now she sat by the window in the small back room and watched the light go gold on the platform and watched Obadiah Crane pace and pace and pace. He had given up smiling about an hour ago. Now he was angry. She could see it in the way he walked. He had been into the saloon twice and come back smelling worse each time, and once he had crossed the street and stood looking up at the front of the inn with his hands on his hips, and Hattie had drawn back from the window and held her breath, and then he had gone away again. The sun touched the top of the western mountains, and then she heard hooves on the wagon road. Two riders came in fast from the east. They came around the curve by the blacksmith shop at a hard canter and pulled up sharp in the middle of the street, and the dust they had brought with them caught the late light and turned the air gold around them. And Hattie pressed her face to the cold glass of the window, and she saw two men on tall bay horses, and the man in front was a giant with chestnut hair and a clean blue shirt under a brown leather coat, and the man behind him was leaner and lighter, and carried a fiddle case slung over his shoulder by a strip of faded ribbon. She did not need anyone to tell her. She knew. Down on the platform, Obadiah Crane saw them too. He stiffened. His hand moved toward the inside of his coat, and then stopped because Callum Holloway had already swung down from the bay and was walking toward him across the dust street with a stride that made other men's strides look like the steps of children, and Ezra Holloway was already off his horse on the other side and was walking parallel to his brother with one hand resting easy on the butt of the pistol at his belt. Crane Callum said, his voice carried up to the open window of the inn. It was not loud. It did not need to be. You are off Holloway land 6 weeks now. Why are you on this platform? Just doing a man a favor, Crane said. Heard there was a lady coming who needed fetching. Where is she? I don't know. She went into the inn an hour ago and she did not come out. Callum stopped. Ezra stopped. The two brothers stood in the middle of the dust street and looked at the front door of the Pine Needle Inn, and then Callum turned his head a quarter inch and spoke to Ezra without taking his eyes from Crane, and Ezra walked toward the inn. Hattie pulled back from the window. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her dusty navy dress with both hands. She touched the small silver cameo at her throat that had been her mother's. She took the letter from inside her glove and held it so tight in her right hand that the paper bent. Then she went down the stairs. The widow Fenwick was at the foot of the stairs looking up. He has come, the widow said. I told you he would. Hattie nodded. She did not trust her voice yet. The front door of the inn opened. Ezra Holloway stepped inside, and Hattie saw him for the first time at close hand. He was tall and lean, and his pale blue eyes went immediately to her face and stayed there. He took his hat off slowly. There was a small smear of trail dust on the side of his nose. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been walking quietly through the world for 29 years and had been waiting to find out what he was supposed to do with himself. Miss Ashford, he said. Mr. Holloway, I am Ezra. My brother is outside. He would like very much to come in and speak with you, but he wanted me to make certain you were well and safe before he did. I am well, she said, and I am safe. Ezra looked at her another long moment. Then he said very quietly, I am sorry. We did not send Obadiah Crane. We did not know he had heard you were coming. The mail rider has been talking in saloons. My brother is going to make this right. Hattie felt the back of her throat go thick, and she swallowed it down hard. I would like to meet your brother, she said. Ezra stepped aside and held the door. Callum Holloway came in. He had to duck his head a fraction to come through the door frame, and when he was inside the parlor of the Pine Needle Inn, he seemed to fill it the way a wood stove fills a small kitchen in winter. And Hattie Ashford looked up at him, and she saw the chestnut hair gone early gray at the temples and the deep amber of his eyes, and the careful, clean blue of the shirt he had ironed for her the night before, and she saw the small wooden box outline in his breast pocket, where her mother's wedding ring lay waiting, and she saw the way his hands hung at his sides, as if he did not quite know what to do with them now that he was actually in front of her. And she thought, oh, he took his hat off. Miss Ashford, he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. It came up out of his chest the way distant thunder comes up out of a mountain. I am Callum Holloway. I am very sorry I was not here when your stage came in. I have a great deal to explain to you, and I will explain all of it on the road home if you will still come with me. But before I say one word more, I need you to know that every word I wrote in those letters was true. I do not make promises I cannot keep. A man keeps his word, and I am that kind of man, and if I am not, then this is the moment for you to learn it and turn back. So I am going to ask you a question, and I am going to give you a real answer to give. Will you come home to Stillwater Ridge tonight and as a guest under my roof and my protection? Or will you take the morning stage back east and let me pay your fare and a sum besides for the trouble I have brought you? The choice is yours. It is the only choice that matters today. Hattie Ashford looked up into the face of Callum Holloway. She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about Mr. Thaddeus Holbrook in the gold watch in the small room on the third floor. She thought about the way her mother had once told her when she was 8 years old and afraid of a thunderstorm that the thing to do with fear was to look at it directly and call it by its name and then walk past it into whatever room came next. She thought about Ezra Holloway holding the door for her with his hat in his hand. She thought about the apple tree she had not yet seen. I have nothing to go back to, Mr. Holloway, she said. I choose Stillwater Ridge. Callum Holloway closed his eyes for 1/2 of 1 second, and when he opened them again, something in his face had moved, and he said the words very quietly, the way a man speaks them when he means them. Then you are home now, Hattie Ashford. It was the first time he called her Hattie. It was the first time anyone in Montana had called her anything at all. Outside on the platform, Obadiah Crane was no longer there. He had walked away while no one was watching, and his horse was gone from the rail in front of the saloon, and the sun had dropped behind the western mountains, and the sky over Granite Falls was the color of a peach left too long in the sun. They did not ride out that night. The widow Fenwick would not hear of it. There is bad country between here and Stillwater, after dark, she said, and there are men in that country who have just been embarrassed in a public street, and only a fool rides into bad country on a tired horse with a frightened woman in tow. You will sleep here. I have 3 rooms and I have a stew on the back of the stove, and I have not had this much company since my husband took the fever in '58. You will sleep here and you will eat at my table, and you will leave at first light, and that is the end of it. So they slept at the Pine Needle Inn. Hattie in the small back room with the window looking down on the empty platform. Callum and Ezra in the hayloft of the inn's small barn, because the widow Fenwick would not have unmarried men sleeping under the same roof as an unmarried woman, even if the unmarried woman had come 1,000 miles to marry one of them. And Callum had said, "Yes, ma'am." And Ezra had touched the brim of his hat to the widow with a small, grave smile, and the 2 brothers had gone out across the yard with a single oil lamp between them. Hattie lay in the dark in the small, clean bed under a quilt that smelled of cedar. She did not sleep at first. She listened to the sounds of the strange new world outside her window. A coyote far up on the ridge, the slow creak of the inn settling on its bones, the wind moving down from the mountains and rattling the dry stalks of last year's hollyhocks against the side of the house. Her own heart beating slow and steady the way her father had taught her to make it beat when she was afraid. Slow breath in, slow breath out. The same Lord watches over Montana that watched over Philadelphia, child. The same stars, the same hand. She slept. In the gray light before dawn, she woke to the smell of bacon and coffee, and she put on the navy traveling dress she had brushed clean the night before by lamplight, and she pinned her honey-colored hair up the way her mother had taught her, and she went down the stairs. Callum Holloway was already at the kitchen table. He stood up when she came into the room. He had shaved at the pump in the yard, and there was a small nick on his jaw where the razor had caught him. He pulled out a chair for her without speaking. The widow Fenwick set a plate down in front of her with 3 strips of bacon and 2 eggs and a thick slice of brown bread, and Ezra came in from outside with cold air on his coat and the smell of horses on his hands, and the 4 of them ate breakfast in the kitchen of the Pine Needle Inn, while the sky outside the window went from gray to pearl to pale gold. When the plates were empty, Callum stood up and counted $3 silver onto the table. 2 for the rooms and 1 for the kindness, he said. The widow Fenwick picked up 2 of the dollars and pushed the third one back across the table with one small wrinkled finger. Kindness is not for sale, Callum Holloway, she said. Now go on and take this child up the mountain, and you take care of her, and you remember that I am watching from down here in this town, and I have a long memory, and I know everyone who passes through. Yes, ma'am, he said. He carried Hattie's trunk out to the spring wagon himself. The road out of Granite Falls climbed for the first 3 miles through a long open meadow of new grass, and then it bent north and east into the timber. And the timber was tall lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, and the air inside it smelled of warm sap and cold stone, and the wagon wheels made a soft hush on the bed of fallen needles. Ezra rode out ahead on his bay. Callum drove the wagon, and Hattie sat on the bench beside him, with her hands folded in her lap and her trunk on the boards behind them, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Then Callum began to talk. He talked the way a man talks who has been alone with his own thoughts for too many years and has finally found someone he wants to give them to. He talked about his father who had come west from Pennsylvania in 1850 with a young wife in a wagon and a dream of building something that would belong to his sons and his sons' sons. He talked about his mother who had planted the apple tree by the kitchen window and who had taught him to read out of a Bible and a book of Tennyson's poems and nothing else. He talked about the winter of 1862 when he was 18 years old and his parents had ridden down to Granite Falls for supplies and never come home, and how he had ridden out 3 days later into the snow with Ezra and Ransom following behind on a single mule, and how he had found his father and mother in a snowdrift 2 miles south of the ridge with the tracks of 7 horses around them, and how he had brought them home in the bed of the wagon and buried them under the apple tree, because the ground there was the only ground he could break with a pickaxe in January. He talked about raising his brothers. He talked about the first cow they had owned, a thin yellow heifer named Pansy. He talked about the way Ezra had taught himself to play the fiddle from a book one winter when there was nothing else to do. He talked about Ransom and about the woman called Caroline Beaumont, and about how Caroline had been the sister of one of the men who had killed his parents in 1862, and how Ransom did not know that part yet, and Callum was waiting for the right time to tell him. He talked about why he had written the advertisement. The house is too quiet, he said. It has been too quiet for 17 years. We have built it up. We have 8,000 acres now, and 400 head of cattle in a barn that took us 3 summers to raise. We have everything a man is supposed to want. And every night when the work is done, I sit on the porch and look at my mother's apple tree, and I think, this is not finished. This is not what she meant when she planted it. She meant a kitchen with a woman in it and children running in and out of the screen door, and a piano in the parlor, and somebody humming while she shelled peas. She meant a home. And I cannot make that by myself, no matter how many fences I build. So I wrote the letter to the matrimonial paper, and I waited, and you wrote back, and you wrote to me about reading scripture to your father in the last winter of his life. And I read your letter 5 times in one evening, and I knew I would wait for you, no matter how long it took. Hattie listened. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and the wind moving the soft tendrils of honey-colored hair around her face, and she watched the road climb and bend and climb again. And she thought about the small gold pocket watch hidden at the bottom of her trunk and the bruise it had left on her conscience, and she thought, I have to tell him. I have to tell him soon, but not today. Today I am only listening. Up ahead on the trail, Ezra reined in his bay and dismounted. He was bent over something on the ground. When the wagon came up behind him, Callum pulled the brake and climbed down. Hattie watched the two brothers crouch in the dust of the trail, and then Ezra straightened up, holding something between his thumb and forefinger. It was a horseshoe nail, new, hammered by hand, driven into the bark of a young pine tree at exactly the height of a tall man's eye. Ezra and Callum looked at each other across it for a long moment without speaking. Then Ezra said one word, "Thrasher." Callum took the nail from his brother's hand and turned it slowly between his fingers and put it in the breast pocket of his coat next to the small wooden box that held his father's gold ring. Hattie called down softly from the wagon. "What is it?" Callum looked up at her. The amber of his eyes was very steady. "A neighbor of ours," he said, "has been marking the road. It is nothing to worry about today. We are still on our own ground. I will tell you about it tonight at the house." He climbed back up to the bench beside her and gathered the reins. But Hattie Ashford had grown up watching the silences of careful men, and she had heard the way the brother on horseback had said the name Thrasher, and she had seen the way the brother beside her had put the nail into his breast pocket, the way another man might put away a folded telegram with bad news in it, and she understood, in the wordless way a woman understands these things, that she was being driven into a war she had not yet been told about. She did not ask. She folded her hands tighter in her lap, and she watched the timber open up ahead of them, and the wagon came around a long, slow curve, and there it was, Stillwater Ridge. The valley fell away to the north into a long open meadow that climbed at the far end into the blue rampart of the Bitterroots. And in the center of the meadow stood a great two-story log house with a stone chimney and a roof of split cedar shingles. And there was a barn behind it as long as the house was wide, and a corral of new pine rails, and a small green plot of herbs along the south wall, and beside the kitchen window. There was an apple tree in full white bloom, and the wind came down off the mountain and moved through the apple blossoms and blew a soft, pale snow of petals across the dooryard. Hattie Ashford put one gloved hand against her mouth. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "It is not a shack," Callum said quietly beside her. "I told you in the letters it was a homestead. I did not tell you we had built it up. I did not want to write words that sounded like boasting. I wanted you to come for me, not for the house. But the house is here, and now it is here for you too, if you decide you want it." He looked at her, then for the first time since the road had been away from Granite Falls. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything else. There was a man standing on the porch. He was as tall as Callum, but built more whip than oak, and his hair was dark blonde and worn long enough to brush his collar, and his eyes were the same amber as his older brother's, but harder the way good amber goes hard when it has been dropped in cold water. He stood with his arms crossed and his weight on one leg, and a Winchester rifle leaning against the porch rail at his right hand. And when the wagon came into the dooryard, he did not move from where he stood. Callum drew up the bays. He set the brake. Hattie did not wait to be helped down. She gathered the dusty hem of her navy dress in one hand, and she stepped down from the wagon by herself, and she walked across the dooryard through the soft, falling apple blossoms, and stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at the youngest Holloway brother and waited. Ransom Holloway looked her up and down once. He did not bother to hide it. He took in the dust on the hem of her dress and the small carpet bag still on the wagon seat, and the silver cameo at her throat, and the way her chin came up the longer he stared at her. Then he said in a voice that was very flat, "You are the woman my brother sent away for." "I am," she said. "Do you know what a Montana winter does to a city woman?" Miss Ashford, Hattie Ashford, had stood 3 hours on a wooden platform yesterday, and she had outwaited Obadiah Crane through an afternoon that had felt longer than any week of her life, and she had eaten her father's last breakfast off a tray she carried up 3 flights of stairs, and she had buried both her parents with her own 2 hands, and she was very tired, and her dress was very dusty, and her trunk was still in the wagon, and the apple petals were still falling on her hair, and so she looked the youngest Holloway brother in the eye, and she said the only true thing she had left to say. Mr. Holloway, she said, I have buried my father and my mother. I have lived 3 years in a house I did not belong in. I have ridden 4 days west from Philadelphia on the word of a stranger. And yesterday I outlasted a drunk thief on a train platform until your brother came for me. A Montana winter is not the worst thing I have ever stood in front of, and I do not intend to die in one. For one very long moment, Ransom Holloway did not move. Then he made a small sound in the back of his throat that might have been a laugh or might have been something else, and he uncrossed his arms, and he reached down without taking his eyes from her face, and he picked up his Winchester from where it leaned against the porch rail, and he turned and he carried it inside the house, and he let the screen door slap shut behind him. Ezra was off his horse. He came up beside Hattie, and he said very quietly, that is the warmest welcome he has given anyone since 1877. Come inside, Miss Ashford. I will show you my mother's room. He held the screen door for her. Hattie stepped over the threshold of the Holloway house at Stillwater Ridge. The kitchen smelled of cold ash and old wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of dried sage hung in bunches from a beam over the stove. The floorboards were broad pine, and they had been scrubbed pale by years of someone's hand and lie. There was a long plank table down the center of the room and 3 ladder-back chairs, and a 4th chair that had been brought in from the porch and set carefully at the place nearest the window, and Hattie understood with a small, soft pang under her breastbone that the 4th chair had been brought in for her. Ezra led her up the stair to a door at the end of the upper hall. He opened it. The room had a 4-post bed under a white coverlet stitched with small blue flowers. There was a rocking chair by the window. There was a low pine dresser with a bone-handled hairbrush laid neatly on a folded square of linen. There was a framed needlework picture on the wall over the bed that read in small, careful cross-stitched letters, "Home is where the heart rests." The window looked east over the meadow toward the morning sun, and the apple tree was directly outside the glass. And as Hattie stood in the doorway, a single white blossom drifted down past the window and turned slowly in the still air of the room. No one has slept in this room since my mother died in 1862, Ezra said. Hattie did not answer at first. She walked into the room and she set her gloved hand very lightly on the bone handle of the hairbrush, and she looked at the cross-stitched letters on the wall, and she looked at the rocking chair, and she looked out the window at the apple tree, and she felt the slow, strange settling sensation in her chest of a long traveling thing that has finally been put down. It is beautiful, she said. I will take care of it. She did not know that she was crying until she felt the wet on her cheek. Ezra did not say anything about the tear. He set the small carpet bag on the rocking chair. He turned in the doorway and looked back at her once with his cold, soft blue eyes, and he gave her a small, grave smile. And then he was gone, and his bootsteps went down the stair, and Hattie Ashford stood in the middle of the bedroom of a woman who had been dead for 17 years, and she put both hands flat over her mouth, and she let herself cry without sound for 1 whole minute by the small ticking clock on the dresser. When she was done, she dried her face with the back of her glove. She unpinned her hat and set it on the dresser. She drew the letter from inside her glove, and she set it on the dresser too, beside the hairbrush, and she smoothed it flat with her fingertips. The letter had said there would be a man waiting at the platform. The letter had said there would be a room kept 17 years. The letter had said home. The letter she thought had not lied at all. The letter had only been waiting for her to be brave enough to believe it. That night, Callum sat with her on the back porch under the stars. The mountains were a dark line against a darker sky, and the air smelled of cold pine and wood smoke from the kitchen stove inside. And somewhere down in the valley, a single coyote called twice and was answered by another. And Ezra was inside playing the fiddle very softly. The long, slow notes of an old hymn called "Come Thou Fount" that Hattie had not heard since the last service her father had ever preached. Callum did not sit close to her. He sat on the top step with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, and she sat in the rocking chair the widow Fenwick had told him to put out for her. And the space between them was the careful space of 2 people who have decided to be careful for as long as it takes. I owe you the truth about a few things he said, So I am going to tell you tonight, and then I am not going to ask you to decide anything until you have slept on it." She nodded. "The man whose mark we found on the trail today is named Mordecai Thrasher," he said. 17 years ago this winter, he led the gang that killed my mother and my father. He was never tried. There was no law in this country in 1862. He has built himself up since then. He owns a place called Iron Hollow over the next ridge. He runs 400 head of his own cattle, and he has been trying to push us off Stillwater for 7 years, and he has not managed it yet. Crane went to work for him after I turned Crane out. Thrasher is the reason Crane was waiting for you at the platform yesterday. Thrasher wanted to know who you were and what you meant to me before I had a chance to tell him. He wanted to take you off the road and use you against me. He may try again. I want you to know that before you sleep one more night under my roof, because if you decide tomorrow that this is too much country for you, I will take you back to Granite Falls myself, and I will not say one word against you for going." He paused. The fiddle inside the house found the long, quiet note at the end of the hymn and held it. "And there is one other thing," he said. "I am offering you a contract for 6 months. You have your room and your meals and the protection of 3 men in the run of this house. You owe me nothing. We will be married in name only at the courthouse in Granite Falls next week if you choose to stay, because Montana law will not let you live here otherwise, but the marriage will be a paper marriage, and I will sleep in the bunkhouse with my brothers until you tell me different, and you will tell me different only if you ever decide you want to. 6 months from tonight, you can take a stage east, and I will pay your fare and $100 besides. Or you can stay. The choice will always be yours. It will not be mine. I will not press you for it. A man keeps his word, Hattie Ashford, and that is my word." The fiddle inside the house began a new tune. It was a slow one. Hattie did not know it. She sat in the rocker for a long time before she answered. She thought about the apple tree blooming outside the window of a room where no woman had slept in 17 years. She thought about a small, kind, round-faced widow in Granite Falls who had said kindness is not for sale. She thought about the way Ezra Holloway had held the door of the Pine Needle Inn open for her with his hat in his hand. She thought about the way Ransom Holloway had picked up his rifle without taking his eyes from her face and carried it inside the house and let the screen door slap shut, and how that somehow had felt like a thing she had passed. She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about a small gold watch at the bottom of her trunk and the man who had given it to her and the lie she was still carrying. She would tell Callum about the watch. She would tell him soon, but not tonight. Tonight she only had one thing to say. "Mr. Holloway," she said, 6 months is a fair contract. I accept it. I will sleep in your mother's room, and I will cook in your mother's kitchen, and I will watch your fence for the men who are watching them already. And I will stand in front of your Montana winter when it comes, and I will not run from it. That is my word." He turned his head and looked at her in the starlight. "Then welcome home, Hattie," he said. "Then you are home now." It was the second time he had said it. She thought she could probably get used to hearing it. Inside the house, Ezra's fiddle moved into the second verse of the slow tune, and somewhere deep in the dark, up on the high shoulder of the ridge, a single horse and rider sat very still in the timberline, and the rider was looking down at the lighted windows of the Holloway house through a brass telescope. And the rider was Mordecai Thrasher, and he lowered the telescope after a long time, and he turned his horse, and he rode back into the dark toward Iron Hollow without making a sound, and the apple petals went on falling slow and soft and white on the porch where Callum Holloway and Harriet Ashford were learning the careful shape of each other's silence under the stars of their first night. The first morning at Stillwater Ridge began with the sound of a rooster. Hattie woke in the 4-post bed under the white coverlet stitched with small blue flowers, and for one long moment she did not know where she was. The light coming through the window was the soft pearl light of high country dawn, and the air in the room smelled of cold pine and something faintly sweet that she could not name, and there was a single white apple petal lying on the pillow beside her head as if it had drifted in through the open window during the night and chosen its own resting place. She sat up slowly and pressed her palm flat against the petal. Then she remembered. She remembered the platform at Granite Falls in the soil of Obadiah Crane and the small, kind hand of the widow Fennick and the long ride up the wagon road in the apple tree and the way Callum Holloway had said, "Welcome home" twice in one night, as if he were not quite sure she had heard him the first time. She remembered the contract. 6 months. She remembered the gold watch at the bottom of her trunk, and the bruise it left on her conscience went on hurting the way old bruises do. She rose. She washed her face in the cold water of the basin on the dresser. She braided her honey-colored hair into a single plait down her back the way she had worn it as a girl in her father's parsonage. She put on her gray wool dress and her plain white apron, and she made the bed with quick, neat hands the way her mother had taught her. And she went down the stair into the kitchen of the Holloway house to begin her first day in the only home she had left in the world. Ezra was already at the stove. He was frying bacon in a heavy black skillet, and he looked up when she came in, and he smiled the small, grave smile that she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of saying good morning. He did not say anything. He moved aside from the stove and handed her the long-handled fork, and Hattie took it without a word. And just like that, the morning belonged to her. She made the biscuits from a recipe she had learned at 12 years old in the church kitchen of her father's congregation. She rolled the dough out on the floured plank table and cut the rounds with the rim of a tin cup, because there was no biscuit cutter, and she set them on a flat black pan and slid the pan into the wood oven and shut the iron door. And when she straightened up, Callum Holloway was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her. He had come in from the barn. There was a piece of straw caught in the cuff of his shirt. His chestnut hair was damp at the temples from washing at the pump. He did not say anything for a moment. He only looked at the floured plank table and the tin cup and the small pile of biscuit dough trimmings on the corner of the board, and Hattie understood with a small, soft pang that he was looking at the ghost of his mother. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway," she said quietly. "Good morning, Hattie." He took his hat off and hung it on the peg by the door. "The biscuits," he said, and then he stopped because he did not seem to have a second part of the sentence ready. "I hope you do not mind," she said. "I did not know what you usually have on a Tuesday." Tuesday, he said, is biscuit day. He said it the way a man states a fact about a country he has just been told he lives in. When the biscuits came out of the oven, they were tall and pale gold with crisp brown crowns, and Ezra ate 3 of them with butter and sorghum and did not speak the entire meal. And when he was done, he set down his fork and looked at her across the table and said, "Only my mother's biscuits." Callum did not say anything to that. He did not need to. He ate 4 biscuits and drank his coffee black and watched her with the still, careful watching of a man who was afraid to scare a deer at the edge of a clearing, and Ransom did not come in for breakfast at all. Ransom came in at 7:30 with his hat already on his head, took 2 biscuits off the plate, without sitting down, looked at Hattie once with his hard amber eyes, gave her one short nod, and walked back out the screen door. The screen door slapped shut behind him. Ezra leaned slightly toward her over his coffee cup. That, he said softly, was the second nod. "You will know you are accepted when you get the third." "How will I know?" she asked. He smiled. "You will know." The first week became the second week, and the second week became the third. And Hattie Ashford learned the shape of a working homestead in the only way a person ever learns it, which is by doing it badly until she did it well. Ezra taught her to milk the brown cow named Pansy, who was the great-granddaughter of the first cow Callum had ever owned. Ezra taught her which plants in the herb garden were sage and which were death camas, and he taught her with great patience, because the difference in the spring before they bloomed was the difference between supper and a funeral. Ezra taught her how to gather the eggs from under the hens without making them shriek, and how to skim the cream off the milk pans, and how to set a pot of beans to soak the night before so they would be soft by supper time the next day. Callum did not teach her. Callum watched. He watched her hang the wash on the long line strung between the kitchen door and the corner of the barn. He watched her carry water from the pump to the kitchen in 2 heavy buckets balanced on a yoke across her shoulders. He watched her on her hands and knees, scrubbing the broad pine floorboards of the kitchen with lye and a stiff brush, her honey-colored braid swinging forward over her shoulder as she worked. He watched her churn butter on the back porch in the long afternoons. He watched and he said almost nothing, but every evening when he came in from the south pasture or the high fence line, there would be some small new thing waiting for her without explanation. A new wooden bucket beside the pump because the old one had begun to leak. A folded square of soft canvas to wrap around the yoke so it would not bruise her shoulders. A rocking chair carried up from the cellar and placed by the kitchen window so she would have somewhere to sit when she snapped beans in the afternoon. He never said, "This is for you." He only set the thing in its place and went about his work, and Hattie learned to find his gifts the way other women find love letters. On the fifth night, she began to read aloud after supper. It was Ezra's idea. He had brought down a small leather-bound book of Tennyson's poems from the shelf in the upstairs hall, the same book his mother had read aloud from when he was small, and he had set it open beside Hattie's plate and said in his quiet voice, "I have not heard a woman read aloud in this kitchen in a very long time. If it would not trouble you." "It would not trouble me," Hattie said. So she read. She read by the yellow light of the kitchen lamp, while Callum sat at the head of the table cleaning the action of his Winchester with an oiled rag, and Ezra sat by the stove with his fiddle across his knees, not playing it, only listening, and Ransom sat in the far corner whittling a piece of cedar into the shape of a horse and pretending he was not listening at all. Hattie read the long, sad lines of Tennyson, and the cadence of her father's pulpit voice came up in her without her meaning it. And when she came to the verse that ran forth, "Though from out are born of time and place, the flood may bear me far. I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar," the cedar shavings stopped coming off Ransom's knife. He set the knife down very slowly. He looked at her across the kitchen, and he said in a voice she had not heard him use before, "My mother used to read that one. On Sunday evenings, right at this table." Hattie did not know what to say. She closed the book around her finger to keep the place. Ransom stood up. He put the half-carved cedar horse on the corner of the table. He walked across the kitchen and out the screen door without another word, and the screen door slapped shut behind him for the second time that day. But the slap had a different sound to it this time, and Hattie felt it in her chest, the way you feel the difference between a door closed in anger and a door closed because a man does not want anyone to see his face. In the morning, the cedar horse was still on the corner of the table. It had not been there when she went up to bed. Someone had set it back in the same spot during the night. It was carved finer than she had realized. The mane was small, careful chisel marks in a row, and the tail was a single curving line, and the small wooden eye on each side of the head had been burned in with a heated needle. Hattie picked it up in her hand and held it for a long, quiet moment, and she understood that she had been given a gift. She had not been told it was a gift, and she set the cedar horse on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, and that was where it would live for the next 40 years. She did not know that yet. She only knew that the kitchen had begun to feel like a place she could stand in. The third week it ended in trouble. It came on a Thursday afternoon. Hattie was alone at the house. Callum and Ransom were riding the high pasture, and Ezra had gone down the south trail to mend a place in the fence where a yearling had pushed through. She was kneeling in the herb garden along the south wall of the kitchen, thinning the new sage with a small pair of iron shears, when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the wagon road from the timber line. She stood up. She brushed the dirt from her knees. The horse came around the bend by the corral, and the rider was a tall man in a dark coat with a rifle laid across his thighs and a face she had never seen in her life. He was perhaps 50 years old. His hair was iron gray under his hat, and his eyes were the cold, pale gray of stone in shallow water. And when he saw her in the herb garden, he drew the horse up at the edge of the dooryard and lifted his hat with a slow, polite movement that did not match the rifle. "Miss Ashford," he said, "the morning is beautiful." Hattie's hand had closed around the handle of the iron shears without her telling it to. "Sir," she said, "I do not believe we have met. Forgive me." My name is Mordecai Thrasher. I run the Iron Hollow place over the next ridge. I am a neighbor of the Holloway brothers, and I have come up the wagon road on perfectly civil business, and I am very sorry to find that none of the gentlemen of the house seem to be at home. He smiled at her, and the smile did not reach his eyes, and Hattie understood that he had ridden up the wagon road precisely because he had known none of the gentlemen of the house would be at home. He had been watching. He had been waiting. He had picked his afternoon. She did not move from the herb garden. I am sorry too, sir, she said. I will leave a small token of welcome with you, if I may. A neighborly thing. He reached into the saddlebag at his knee, and Hattie's heart climbed up into the back of her throat. He drew out a small object wrapped in a square of dark blue cloth, and he held it down to her from the saddle. Hattie did not move. After a long moment, he leaned forward and set the small wrapped object on the corner post of the porch rail and straightened back up in the saddle. A welcome gift, he said, from a neighbor. I do hope you and Mr. Holloway will be very happy. Montana winters can be very long, Miss Ashford. A woman alone on a ridge can find them very hard. Please do remember that the Iron Hollow is only 6 miles over the saddle, and if you ever find yourself in need of a true friend in this country, you must not hesitate. Then he turned the horse and rode back down the wagon road at a slow walk, and the slow walk was worse than a gallop would have been, because it told her he was not afraid of being seen. Hattie did not move until the sound of hoof beats was gone from the timber. Then she walked slowly across the yard to the porch rail, and she picked up the small wrapped object, and she drew back the dark blue cloth. It was a gold pocket watch. It was not the gold pocket watch from the bottom of her trunk. It was a different one, older, heavier, with a chased lid, and the engraving worn nearly smooth by years of being carried in a man's vest pocket. But the message was as clear as if Mordecai Thrasher had written it across the kitchen wall in coal. He knew about Mr. Thaddeus Holbrook of Philadelphia. He knew about the gift she had not asked for. He knew the shape of the chain that had driven her west. He was telling her that he could put a new chain on her any time he wanted. Hattie sat down on the porch step.